The castle stood in defiance of time, its jagged towers clawing at the sky like the broken fingers of a buried giant. It had no name, or rather, none that could be spoken without an uneasy glance over the shoulder. To the locals, it was simply the keep, a relic of a forgotten kingdom that no one dared approach. Yet, the letter that arrived in Edward Hailwick's hands bore a wax seal pressed with a sigil unfamiliar to him, a crown skull encircled by thorns. The words, scrawled in a hand both elegant and forceful, invited him to a gathering within the castle's walls. No sender's name, no return address, just a date and an instruction: come alone. Edward was not a man given to superstition, nor was he easily shaken by old legends. A historian by trade, he had dedicated his life to unearthing the truths buried beneath myths. The castle, with its whispered tales of madness, was precisely the kind of mystery that piqued his curiosity. It had been abandoned for centuries, its last recorded occupant a mad king who had supposedly sealed himself inside with his court, never to be seen again. If nothing else, Edward expected a crumbling ruin filled with little more than dust and decayed grandeur. The thought of it thrilled him. The journey to the castle was as unsettling as the invitation itself. The path leading to it had long been swallowed by the forest, forcing him to travel on foot through an oppressive maze of skeletal trees. Their branches twisted unnaturally, as if frozen mid-scream. The air thickened the closer he got, weighed down by an almost tangible silence. No birds sang, no wind stirred. Even his own footsteps seemed muted, absorbed by the damp earth. The castle loomed ahead, its gates ajar, inviting. Stepping inside, Edward was struck by an eerie sense of preservation. The great hall, though dust-covered and dim, was not the ruin he had expected. Chandeliers still hung from the vaulted ceiling, their rusted chains creaking slightly. A long dining table stretched the length of the chamber, set with tarnished silverware and goblets filled with something too dark to be wine. Along the walls, portraits of long-dead nobles stared down, their eyes glinting in the flickering candlelight. At the far end of the room, a grand chair, too elaborate to be anything but a throne, sat empty. As he took in the scene, a sound broke the silence. A slow, deliberate tapping. He turned sharply, expecting to see his mysterious host, but found only a suit of armor standing in the corner. The tapping stopped the moment his gaze met its visor. The air felt heavier now, pressing against his skin, urging him to leave. But the historian in him would not be deterred. He moved deeper into the castle, following corridors that seemed to shift in the dim light. Doors that should have led outside opened into more halls, twisting his sense of direction. Though he had not seen a single living soul, he was not alone. He could feel it, something watching, moving just beyond the edges of his vision. Once he caught a glimpse of a figure in the reflection of a broken mirror, but when he turned, there was only empty air. The deeper he ventured, the more the castle revealed its secrets. At the base of a spiraling staircase, he found a painting that had not been there before. It depicted the very room he stood in, only it was filled with people in period attire, their faces blurred and indistinct. In the center of the painting, seated in the grand chair, was a figure whose face had been violently scratched out. The paint was fresh. A chill ran through him as he backed away, his footstep echoing through the silence. But then, an answer, a voice, smooth as silk and rich with amusement, spoke from the shadows. "You're not the first to come, but perhaps you will be the last." The doors to the great hall slammed shut. The candlelight flickered and died, swallowed by the dark. And Edward, for the first time in his life, felt the gnawing bite of true fear. The darkness was absolute. Edward's breath came fast, shallow, as he fought to steady his pulse. The voice had been close, too close, but there was no movement in the suffocating black. He reached for his pocket flashlight, fingers fumbling against the fabric of his coat. The moment he switched it on, the beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the empty great hall. The doors that had slammed shut were now wide open. The painting, The one that had shown a blurred crowd and a faceless ruler was gone. He swallowed hard. It had to be a trick of the mind. His nerves, frayed by the suffocating atmosphere of the castle, were conjuring things that weren't there. A draft could have moved the doors. He was alone. He had to be. The whispering began then, soft, like wind rushing through unseen cracks in the stone. But there was no wind, and the voices were not natural. They overlapped in hushed tones, unintelligible yet unmistakably human. Edward swept his flashlight across the walls, but nothing stirred. The sound seemed to be coming from beneath his feet. Swallowing his apprehension, he moved cautiously through the hall, tracing the source of the whispers. The voices ebbed and flowed, guiding him through winding passages that should not have existed. The castle had rearranged itself. Hallways where there had been none, doors leading into rooms that should have been outside the perimeter of the building. It was as if the very walls were breathing, shifting. At last, he reached an arched doorway, the wood damp with age and rot. Beyond it, a spiral staircase wound downward into the depths of the keep. The whispers grew stronger, more urgent, slipping between languages he half recognized but could not place. Latin? Old English? Something older still? His flashlight flickered as he descended. The stairs ended in a crypt-like chamber lined with stone coffins. The air was thick, pungent with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood or something worse. Strange symbols had been carved into the sarcophagi, their meanings lost to time. He moved carefully, his breath shallow, when a sudden movement made him freeze. One of the coffins was not sealed. Its lid was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking from within. Edward felt a primal urge to flee, but the historian in him fought back the fear. He had come here for answers. He had a look. Bracing himself, he reached forward and pushed the lid aside. Inside was no skeleton, no remains of a forgotten noble. Instead, there was fabric, velvet, deep red, and embroidered with golden thread. It was a robe, one that still held its shape, as if an invisible body lay within. And then the air shifted. A hand, pale and cold as marble, shot from within the robes and gripped his wrist. Edward's scream caught in his throat as the fingers tightened with impossible strength. The whispers erupted into a chorus of hissing voices, filling his skull, drowning his thoughts. The thing in the coffin pulled, and for a moment he felt himself being drawn into the darkness, his vision tunneling, his breath thinning. Then just as suddenly the grip loosened, the whispers stopped. The air was still. Edward yanked his arm back, stumbling away, his pulse hammering in his ears. The coffin was empty. The robes lay undisturbed, as if they had never moved. But his wrist burned with the impression of fingers that had been very, very real. He staggered back, chest heaving, and realized something had changed. The staircase behind him was gone. The chamber had sealed itself. He was trapped, and from the shadows, a single whisper returned, closer than before. "You should not have come." Edward's pulse pounded in his ears, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The crypt was no longer just an ancient chamber. It was a living entity, shifting, trapping him within its cold embrace. The walls, damp with condensation, felt as if they were closing in, breathing in time with the whispers that slithered through the air. He swallowed hard, scanning the dimly lit space for any sign of an exit. But there was none. The staircase had vanished, swallowed by the castle's malevolent will. His flashlight flickered. The battery was fresh. He had checked before leaving, but the beam wavered as if struggling against some unseen force. When the light stabilized, his breath hitched. The stone coffins were no longer still. Their lids, once sealed by centuries of dust, were shifting, some by inches, others by mere fractions, but all unmistakably moving. A guttural scraping filled the chamber as one of the lids slid completely aside. Edward braced himself, expecting a corpse, bones, anything rational. But the coffin was empty. Nothing lay within except the imprint of where a body should have rested. He stepped back, his boots scraping against the uneven floor, and the whispering grew louder. Then the air grew heavy. A presence unseen but undeniable pressed against him, wrapping around his shoulders like an unseen weight. His skin prickled with cold, the sensation creeping along his spine. He turned sharply, swinging his flashlight toward the center of the room, and there it was, a figure. It stood at the far end of the chamber, shrouded in a cloak of blackened velvet, its face obscured by the shadows of its hood. Though it did not move, Edward felt its gaze upon him, piercing through the dim light like twin daggers of ice. His throat went dry. He wanted to run, to break into a desperate sprint, but his body refused to obey. The figure raised a single hand, long, slender fingers emerging from the darkness of its robe. It did not point at him. Instead, it gestured toward the empty coffin, a silent command. "No," Edward rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. He stepped backward, shaking his head. The figure remained still, but the pressure in the air thickened, as though the very walls were waiting for his compliance. And then, the whispering ceased. Silence fell, unnatural and absolute. Edward dared not move, dared not even breathe too loudly. The figure did not approach, did not waver. But the longer he looked, the more he saw. Beneath the hood, the darkness was not empty. It was moving, shifting, a mass of something writhing beneath the fabric. A deep, rattling breath echoed through the chamber, though the figure's chest did not rise or fall. The sound vibrated against Edward's ribs, as though the very air had inhaled. And then it spoke, not in a whisper, but in a voice that was everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are already part of the story, historian. Do not resist the ink." Edward staggered back, heart hammering. He didn't understand the words, but something in him knew their weight. The walls of the crypt had no doors, no openings, yet the figure had come from somewhere. There was a way out. Gritting his teeth, he forced his body into motion. He turned, searching for something, anything, a passage, a flaw in the stone, a weakness in the castle's labyrinthine will. But when he looked back, the figure was gone. Only the whisper remained, threading through the dark. The past is never buried. The silence in the crypt was unnatural, stretching beyond the absence of sound into something deeper, something hollow. Edward stood frozen, his breath shallow, listening, waiting. The figure was gone, but its presence clung to the air like the remnants of a fading nightmare. He could still hear the last whisper, curling in the back of his mind like an unfinished sentence. The past is never buried. He turned in slow circles, scanning the crypt with his flickering flashlight. The empty coffins, the shifting walls, the vanished staircase. This was no longer just an ancient ruin. The castle had become something sentient, something aware of him. The historian in him had spent years chasing the remnants of lost civilizations, but never had he imagined the past might chase him back. Then a sound, soft, rhythmic, just at the edge of perception. It was a heartbeat, not his own, but something deeper, heavier, coming from the very stone itself. The walls pulsed in time with it, as if something vast and unseen lay beneath the castle, its slumber disturbed by Edward's presence. A tremor ran through the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. The coffins rattled, as if struck by an invisible hand. Edward braced himself against the nearest stone slab, his mind racing. He had to find a way out before the crypt sealed itself for good. His gaze landed on an archway that had not been there moments before. It was narrow, carved into the ancient rock, leading downward. The air beyond it shimmered faintly, as if resisting reality itself. He had no other choice. Clutching his flashlight, he stepped forward, his own footsteps sounding muffled, absorbed by the oppressive weight of the stone. The passage twisted, winding downward in uneven spirals. The deeper he went, the more the walls changed. The rough-hewn stone gave way to something older, something worn smooth by centuries of touch. Faint carvings lined the corridor, figures with hollow faces, their hands raised towards something unseen. Edward ran his fingers over the grooves, trying to decipher their meaning. But the moment he touched them, the air thickened. A voice, distant yet impossibly close, rasped through the dark. "He took our names." Edward's breath hitched. The whisper did not come from behind him. It did not come from ahead. It came from the walls themselves. He turned sharply, sweeping the flashlight across the carvings. The figures had changed. Where before they had been still, now their hands seemed to stretch further, their hollow faces tilting toward him. He stumbled back, pulse hammering. His mind rebelled against what he was seeing, but there was no denying it. The stone was watching him. Then, something moved at the edge of the light. A figure, tall, cloaked, faceless, standing just beyond reach. Edward swung the beam toward it, but there was nothing. Just the empty corridor, the whispering stone, and the deep, slow heartbeat that echoed from below. He had no time to hesitate. He pressed forward, half walking, half running, desperate to escape whatever force had twisted the castle into its current form. The passage grew tighter, the carvings more erratic, their hollow faces now contorted in silent screams. And then light. A pale, flickering glow ahead. Not daylight, but something artificial, something wrong. Edward stumbled forward, rounding a final bend, and found himself in a vast underground chamber. Candles lined the perimeter, casting long, shifting shadows. And in the center stood a throne of bone, ancient and cracked with age. But it was not empty. Seated upon it was a figure draped in the same red and gold robes Edward had seen in the coffin. Its head was bowed, hands resting upon the armrests, fingers curled as if frozen mid-thought. At first, Edward thought it might be another illusion, another cruel trick of the castle. But then the figure stirred. The head lifted slowly, revealing a face that should have long since turned to dust. Eyes black as the void fixed upon Edward, and in that moment he understood. The ruler of the forgotten castle had never truly died, and now Edward was his guest. The chamber seemed to breathe. The flickering candlelight cast erratic shadows across the walls, making the throne of bone appear to shift as though its form was never truly fixed. Edward's breath caught in his throat as he met the gaze of the figure before him. The ruler, or whatever remained of him, did not speak. His presence alone was a force pressing against the air, suffocating and undeniable. Edward wanted to run, but his feet remained rooted to the cold stone. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, yet he could not tear himself away. The figure's skin was parchment thin, stretched tight over a skeletal frame, yet its black eyes burned with something ancient and knowing. The castle had trapped him here for a reason, and now he was face to face with its master. The silence shattered. A low, guttural rasp escaped the ruler's lips. Not quite a breath, not quite a word, but something between the two. Edward flinched as the sound crawled into his ears, slithering beneath his skin. It was language, though no tongue he recognized. The voice did not echo, did not carry. It simply was pressing into his mind like fingers sinking into damp earth. Then, in a voice that did not belong to the living, the figure spoke. "You stand before the last king." The words were heavy, soaked in time itself. Edward swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper when he found the courage to speak. Who are you?" The ruler tilted his head, the motion slow, deliberate. "I was once named. Now, I am only what remains." His lips did not move with the words, yet Edward heard them all the same, reverberating through his bones. The candles flared, their flames stretching unnaturally tall, throwing jagged shadows across the chamber. The walls, once smooth, now bore carvings, images of war, betrayal, and something far worse. Edward turned, eyes scanning the grotesque scenes. A throne room much like this one, a ruler crowned in gold and blood, his people kneeling in fear. Then a ritual, a mass execution, bodies hollowed out, their faces erased. The final image made Edward's stomach turn. It was the ruler himself, seated upon the throne of bone, his eyes black voids, his body decayed yet eternal. Edward's pulse pounded in his ears. He understood now. The ruler had not simply died. He had been bound to this place, tethered to the very stones of the castle. His people had tried to erase him, to bury his legacy beneath centuries of dust and ruin. But something had gone terribly wrong. The The ruler raised a skeletal hand, palm upturned. The air around him seemed to twist, bending toward his outstretched fingers. "Historian," he said, his voice like the shifting of ancient tombstones. "Do you know why you were called here?" Edward shook his head. "You are not the first." The ruler's hollow gaze bore into him. "But you are the last." The floor trembled beneath Edward's feet. The heartbeat in the stone grew louder, deeper, as if something vast was stirring beneath the castle. The carvings on the walls seemed to shift, the faceless figures turning toward him, their hollow eyes filled with something like pleading. The ruler rose from the throne in a slow, fluid motion, though his joints should have long since stiffened with decay. He took a step forward, and with it, the room darkened. The candle flames guttered, struggling against the void pressing in. "The past does not rest," the ruler intoned. "It must be carried." The walls groaned, as if the castle itself was awakening. Edward stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The entrance had vanished, replaced by nothing but endless black stone. He was trapped, and then the whisper returned, curling through the chamber like smoke. "The past is never buried." Edward barely had time to scream before the darkness swallowed him whole. Edward fell, not in the way one falls from a ledge or into water, but as if gravity itself had betrayed him, pulling him down through something denser than air, yet emptier than space. The darkness devoured all sense of direction, stretching time into an eternity of descent. His breath quickened, but there was no air to carry it. His limbs flailed, but there was no ground to meet them. And then, without warning, he landed. The impact did not break him, though it should have. The floor beneath him was impossibly smooth, as if it had been worn down by the passage of countless years. He gasped, pressing his palms against the cold stone, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The darkness here was not complete. It moved, thick as fog, curling at the edges of his vision. Somewhere distant, the heartbeat continued, steady and deep, vibrating through the ground. He could not tell if it was coming from above, below, or within him. Edward forced himself to his feet, his body trembling. He was in another chamber, larger than the last, but utterly devoid of light except for the sickly glow emanating from veins of something embedded in the walls. They pulsed faintly, like the roots of an ancient tree feeding on something unseen. And then he saw them. Shadows, shifting at the edges of the room. They were not quite human, elongated, stretched, their faces indistinct. They did not move as one, yet they shared a terrible unity, their presence filling the air with an unbearable weight. He recognized them at once. The faceless, the ones carved into the walls above. They whispered, not with voices, but with the rustling of unseen fabric, the creak of old wood, the sigh of something lost to time. Edward staggered back, his breath catching in his throat as they closed in, moving without movement, forming a circle around him. And then, from within them, a voice. Not the ruler's. Something older. "You walk where only the dead remain." Edward's mind reeled. He had spent his life chasing history, piecing together fragments of forgotten civilizations. But this was something history itself had abandoned. He clenched his fists, forcing his voice through his terror. What is this place?" The shadows shifted. The veins in the walls pulsed faster. A debt unpaid. A name erased. The words twisted through him, not spoken but given, pressing against his ribs like a weight he could not bear. The faceless figures drew closer, and Edward realized with a horrifying certainty that they were waiting for him to understand. And then, the final whisper, the one that shattered him. "You must carry the name." The past was never buried. It was waiting for someone to bear its weight. Edward's pulse pounded in his ears, louder even than the unseen heartbeat vibrating through the stone. The faceless figures did not move in the way the living did. They drifted, they pulsed, they simply were. And yet, they exuded an expectation so tangible it pressed against his chest, suffocating him. "You must carry the name." The words rattled inside his skull. Edward swallowed hard, his mouth dry, his mind spinning with the weight of history pressing upon him. He had spent his life uncovering the stories of the past, but he had never imagined the past would demand something in return. He forced himself to speak, though his voice cracked. Whose name? The figures did not answer. Instead, the walls shuddered, as though the castle itself had inhaled. The pulsing veins along the stone walls darkened, shifting from a sickly glow to an ominous crimson. The air thickened, and Edward felt something cold slide against his skin, though nothing was there. Then he saw it, a single word carved into the floor beneath him. It had not been there a moment ago, and yet he knew it had always existed. The letters were jagged, uneven, as though they had been carved with desperate hands. The name was ancient, older than the castle itself, and something deep within him recognized it. He did not want to say it. His instincts screamed against it, every fiber of his being urging him to turn away, to deny its presence, to reject the weight it carried. And yet, the faceless figures leaned in, waiting, expectant. Edward's lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. Is this the name? The moment the words left his mouth, the entire chamber shifted. Not in a physical sense, but in something deeper, something wrong. The air became heavier, as if he had stepped into a reality that was never meant to be touched. The figures trembled, their formless faces stretching, distorting. Then they screamed. The sound was not of this world. It was not the wail of pain, nor the shriek of terror. It was the sound of something breaking. The walls cracked, the floor split, and the castle itself roared in defiance. Edward staggered back, his hands over his ears, but the scream was not something that could be blocked out. It was inside him, rattling his bones, threading itself into his mind like a parasite. And then silence. The figures were gone. The chamber was empty. But Edward was not alone. A voice, soft yet deafening, filled the void. Now you bear it. Edward fell to his knees, his breath ragged. The name had passed him, and with it, a fate he could not yet comprehend. Edward remained on his knees, his hands pressed to the cold stone floor, his breathing ragged. The name, that name, was his now. Though he had not spoken it aloud, it had carved itself into his mind, into the marrow of his bones. He could feel it there, a writhing presence that did not belong, something older than words and heavier than memory. The chamber had changed. The walls no longer pulsed with sickly veins, and the faceless figures had vanished as if they had never been there. But the castle had not returned to silence. The unseen heartbeat that had lurked at the edges of his awareness now matched his own. He was no longer just an observer in this place. He was part of it. He pushed himself upright, his legs unsteady, and turned in slow circles, scanning the vast chamber. There was no visible exit, only the oppressive stone stretching endlessly in all directions. The air was thick with an expectancy he could not place, as though something watched from just beyond sight, waiting for him to move. Then a sound, not the heartbeat, not the whispering wind that should not exist underground. This was different. A footstep. Edward's body tensed, his every muscle rigid. The step echoed from behind him, slow and deliberate. He turned sharply, his heart hammering, but the chamber remained empty. The silence stretched thin. Then, another step, closer this time. His breath hitched. It was not his own. Something else was in the room with him. A shadow flickered at the very edge of his vision, shifting just beyond his ability to focus. He turned again, but it was gone. His pulse thundered in his ears as realization crept in, slow and dreadful. The castle had not given him the name as a burden. It had given it to him as a beacon. He was being followed. A cold sweat broke across his skin. He needed to move. His eyes darted along the chamber, searching desperately for any sign of an exit. The air pressed heavier against him, like invisible hands guiding him towards something unseen. He hesitated only for a moment before he ran, not in blind panic, but in the direction his instinct screamed was the only way out. The footsteps followed. They were measured, patient. Not a chase, but a pursuit. He sprinted through the chamber, its boundaries shifting around him as if the castle itself refused to remain solid. His breaths came fast, but the footsteps never wavered, never hurried. They did not need to. Edward did not need to turn around to know the truth. Whatever walked behind him was not human, and it would never stop. Edward ran, his footsteps pounding against the uneven stone, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The chamber twisted around him, shifting in ways that defied logic, corridors stretching and shrinking as if the castle itself was alive. The walls no longer pulsed, but something in the air vibrated with a presence, an awareness that had locked onto him the moment the name had been passed. And behind him, the footsteps followed, measured, unhurried, never stopping. Edward knew that whatever stalked him did not need to chase him down. It was inevitable, patient. It had waited before, and it would wait again. His mind screamed for him to turn and face it, to rip away the veil of the unknown, but some primal instinct buried deep in his bones refused. Whatever he saw, it would change him, and not for the better. The corridor before him split into two paths, one stretching downward into a spiraling abyss, the other leading to a narrow stone bridge that connected to an archway at the other end. Neither choice was comforting, but hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. He lunged forward onto the bridge, his fingers gripping the rough stone railing as his body fought to keep balance. Then the whisper came, "You are the last." The words were not spoken in the way a voice should be. They slithered inside his mind, curling around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. He gasped, his vision swimming as he stumbled forward, barely keeping himself from toppling over the edge of the bridge. "You are the last to carry the name." The castle groaned, its ancient stones grinding together like the shifting bones of something too old to die. Edward forced himself forward, his hands grazing the walls of the archway as he staggered into a vast chamber on the other side. The room was different from the others, circular, lined with towering pillars, each carved with faces frozen in silent screams. And at the center of the chamber, an altar stood, its surface marked with deep gouges. Bloodstains, long dried, darkened the stone. Edward's chest heaved. He did not want to understand, but the truth seeped into him regardless. This was a place of endings, a place where those who carried the name before him had stood, just as he did now, and none of them had left. A breath of cold air touched the back of his neck. He turned. For the first time, he saw it. The figure was tall, impossibly so, its limbs stretching like something that had forgotten how to be human. Its face, if it had one, was a hollow void, a gap in reality where features should have been. But it was not the shape of the thing that filled Edward with true horror. It was the weight of its presence, the suffocating certainty that it had always been here, watching, waiting for the next name-bearer to arrive. They all failed. The whisper came again, though the thing before him did not move. Edward's legs locked in place. His mind screamed for him to flee, to claw his way out of this place, but deep down, he knew the truth. This was not something he could escape. This was something he had inherited. Edward stood frozen in the circular chamber, the figure looming before him like a specter pulled from the depths of nightmares. Its presence distorted the very air around it, the temperature dropping to an almost unbearable chill. Panic surged within him, but beneath the panic was something darker. Curiosity, fascination, and an unshakable sense of fate pulling him toward the unknown. As he stared into the void that was its face, memories of the castle's history surged through him, unbidden and chaotic. The stories he had once recited to eager listeners. The fallen lords, the ancient battles, the twisted rituals performed to appease the darkness that dwelled within these stones, now felt like echoes in a distant corridor. He was no longer just an observer. He was part of the tale, woven into its fabric as tightly as the shadows that danced around the chamber. The figure remained still, but Edward could feel the weight of its gaze, an unyielding scrutiny that pierced through the fog of his thoughts. Suddenly, the shadows began to stir, swirling around him like a tempest, forming shapes and figures that flickered in and out of existence. Edward stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to go. The altar loomed behind him, a dark reminder of the fate that had befallen those before him. "You must dance," the figure whispered, its voice a low rasp that seemed to echo from the stone walls. Dance? The absurdity of the command clashed with the dread pooling in his stomach. He shook his head, attempting to deny the impossibility of such an act. Yet, the shadows thickened, closing in around him like a shroud, and before he realized it, his feet were moving. He was drawn into a rhythm that echoed through the chamber, each step guided by an unseen force. As he danced, the shadows followed, swirling and twisting in time with his movements. They formed faces that leered and smiled, mocking him with expressions of triumph and despair. The chamber pulsated with energy, the ancient stones vibrating with the rhythm of his steps, and Edward felt himself losing touch with reality. Each spin, each turn, dragged him deeper into the essence of the castle, and with it, the burden of the name he now carried. Edward could sense the entity watching him, a silent conductor to this macabre symphony. It was as though the dance was not merely a display, but a reckoning, a confrontation with the darkness that had haunted the castle for centuries. The shadows began to merge, forming a tapestry of past name-bearers, those who had come before him, their hopes and fears intertwined in a ballet of light and darkness. As he danced, flashes of their memories surged through him, visions of the lives they had led, the choices they had made, the mistakes that had sealed their fates. Each one had borne the name, and each had faced the same specter that now stood in the shadows. With each movement, Edward felt their pain, their regrets, their struggles for redemption echoing within him. The chamber spun wildly, disorienting him, and he fought to hold onto himself. The entity beckoned, its whispers laced with promises of power and knowledge. But he felt the truth rising within him, raw and undeniable. This was not a gift, it was a curse. The dance was not his choice, it was his obligation. With one final step, he broke from the rhythm, halting the spiraling chaos that enveloped him. The shadows hesitated, flickering as if caught off guard. For a brief moment, the chamber fell silent, the figures receding into darkness. Edward stood in the stillness, the weight of the name heavy on his shoulders, the specter looming closer, its whisper echoing through his mind. You cannot escape what you are. The stillness hung in the air, thick and oppressive, as Edward struggled to comprehend the enormity of what he had just experienced. The shadows faded back into the periphery of the chamber, retreating like a tide that had finally met its shore. But the echo of their presence lingered, a reminder of the dance he could not forget. The entity before him loomed larger than ever, a titan of despair rooted in the very essence of the castle. Edward's heart raced, each beat a drum calling him to make a choice. The whisper of the shadows was still with him, entwining itself around his consciousness. There was a dreadful intimacy to their presence. He had danced with them, felt their histories course through him, and now he was burdened with their stories. Each name echoed in his mind like a lament, and he knew he could not ignore the weight of their fates. Determination began to replace his fear as he confronted the figure. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice steady despite the tremors running through his body. The shadows rippled, flickering at the edges of his vision, but the entity remained silent, its empty gaze fixed upon him. "To remember," it finally replied, the words reverberating through the chamber like thunder. "You must remember what has been forgotten." The phrase struck him like a bolt of lightning. He thought of the tales he had shared, the lore passed down through generations, and the fragments of history lost to time. Each name-bearer before him had succumbed to the curse of forgetfulness, their legacies buried beneath layers of dust and despair. He realized now that the shadows he had danced with were not merely vengeful spirits. They were remnants of those who had once thrived, their lives reduced to echoes. With a newfound clarity, Edward took a step closer to the altar. The cold stone surface felt alive beneath his fingertips, pulsating with energy. He could almost hear the whispers of the past resonating through the air, begging him to uncover the truth. He closed his eyes, focusing on the stories that had shaped the castle's history, the tragedies that had left their marks on its walls. As he opened his eyes, he was transported to a time long forgotten. The chamber around him shifted, morphing into a grand hall, alive with vibrant colors and the sound of laughter. He saw figures dancing beneath flickering torches, their faces lit with joy and purpose. But even amidst the revelry, a shadow loomed, lurking at the edges of their happiness. The scene shifted again, and Edward found himself in a darkened room. A council of lords gathered around a table. Their voices were raised in heated debate, but the tension in the air was palpable. They spoke of power and fear, of ancient rituals meant to protect them from the darkness that encroached upon their lives. Yet Edward knew, with a sinking feeling, that their choices would lead to despair. The images blurred, and suddenly he stood before a woman, her face etched with determination. She clutched a dagger, her resolve evident as she faced an unseen threat. Edward could feel her heartbeat, the pulse of courage that throbbed in her chest. But the shadows encroached, whispering doubts that tore at her conviction. In an instant, she faltered, the dagger slipping from her grasp as despair consumed her. With each flash of memory, Edward felt the burden grow heavier. He could no longer view these figures as mere stories. They were part of him, fragments of a lineage he could no longer deny. The echoes of the past entwined with his own reality, blurring the line between who he was and who he had to become. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the castle pressing down upon him. "I will remember," he vowed, his voice strong and resolute. "I will not let their stories fade into oblivion." As he spoke those words, the entity shifted, its form rippling as if it recognized the significance of his commitment. The shadows around him brightened momentarily, and for the first time, Edward felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps, in remembering, he could break the cycle that had bound him and those before him to this cursed castle. Perhaps he could reclaim not only his own fate, but the fates of all who had come before. The chamber vibrated with an energy that resonated deep within Edward's bones as he felt the power of his declaration wash over him. The shadows that had once seemed menacing now pulsed with a rhythm of recognition, swirling around him like a cloak woven from the threads of forgotten tales. The entity, still a silent observer, appeared to shift slightly, its presence both daunting and enlightening. Edward understood that he had entered a precarious pact, not just with the past, but with the future he was yet to define. As the echoes of ancient memories swirled around him, Edward was thrust into an even deeper dive into the castle's history. It was as if the very stones were awakening, recounting stories that had lain dormant for centuries. He could hear the whispers growing louder, a cacophony of voices blending into one urgent message. "Learn from us. Do not repeat our mistakes." With every heartbeat, he absorbed the lessons of those who had come before him. He saw visions of triumph and despair, of families torn apart by betrayal, alliances forged in the heat of conflict, and moments of fragile peace shattered by ambition and greed. Each fragment felt like a weight added to his shoulders, a reminder of the legacy he now carried. He was no longer merely a curious scholar. He was a vessel for the wisdom and tragedies of generations. Yet, amid this newfound knowledge, an unsettling realization settled in the pit of his stomach. Understanding the past was only part of the burden. With knowledge came responsibility. Edward had to confront the choices that would lead him down a different path. He could not allow the dark legacy of the castle to continue. He needed to break the cycle of despair that had ensnared the name-bearers. In the throes of this realization, Edward found himself standing at the precipice of a crucial decision. The echoes had formed a path before him, leading deeper into the castle's heart, a path that promised both revelation and peril. The shadows beckoned him forward, intertwining with the fabric of his being, urging him to uncover the hidden truths that lay beyond the chamber walls. Taking a deep breath, Edward stepped forward, feeling the pulse of the castle guiding him. The air grew thicker, saturated with the weight of history, and he sensed the looming presence of the entity, now an ever-watchful guardian of the secrets he was about to unearth. As he ventured further into the castle's depths, the very structure seemed to shift, adjusting to accommodate his journey. The walls closed in, adorned with faded tapestries that depicted scenes of both glory and ruin. They told tales of battles won and lost, of love that had blossomed amidst chaos, and a betrayal that had turned friends into enemies. The imagery was hauntingly beautiful, a reminder of the fragility of life and the complexities of human nature. Edward felt a deep connection to these stories, as if he were meant to carry their weight. In a dimly lit corridor, he paused, captivated by a particular tapestry that depicted a grand ball, where figures danced under the watchful eyes of the castle's lords. Yet, there was a shadow lurking in the background, a figure cloaked in darkness, its intentions obscured. Edward's heart raced as he recognized the parallel to his own life, a celebration marred by an unseen threat. This was the warning the shadows had whispered. The danger was ever present, waiting to ensnare those who dared to celebrate without acknowledging the darkness that lingered. Suddenly, a surge of urgency coursed through him. The figure in the tapestry was no mere specter. It represented the very essence of the castle's curse. Edward realized he had to confront this darkness head-on. He could no longer be an observer of history. He must become an agent of change. To break the cycle, he needed to face the shadows within himself, as well as those that haunted the castle. Stepping into the next room, he found a forgotten library, filled with dusty tomes and scrolls that chronicled the castle's lineage. It was here he could uncover the true nature of the darkness that had consumed so many before him. He approached the nearest tome, its cover worn and delicate. As he opened it, a rush of cold air swept through the room, and the whispers intensified, urging him to delve deeper into the secrets contained within. Edward realized that knowledge was a double-edged sword. It could empower him to rewrite the ending of the tale, but could also reveal truths he was unprepared to face. Yet, with the weight of generations pressing upon him, he knew he had no choice but to continue. The fate of the castle, and perhaps his own, depended on his willingness to confront the shadows, both those that roamed the castle and those that lay buried deep within his soul. Edward stood in the forgotten library, his fingers tracing the brittle pages of the ancient tome before him. The air was thick with dust, swirling in the dim light like remnants of a long-forgotten past. The words on the pages were inscribed in a language that he did not fully recognize. Yet as he stared at them, something deep within him stirred. It was as if the knowledge contained within the book was not meant to be read in the conventional sense, but rather absorbed, etched into the very fabric of his consciousness. A chill ran down his spine as he turned a page, and suddenly, the air in the room grew heavy, almost suffocating. The walls of the library seemed to contract, the towering bookshelves pressing in as if they, too, were bearing witness to the truths he was about to uncover. A low whisper slithered through the silence, a voice not quite human, not quite alive. "You seek the truth, but the truth is never kind," it murmured. Edward swallowed hard, refusing to be deterred. He had come too far to turn back now. His eyes scanned the pages, and at last he found what he was looking for, an account of the castle's last master, Lord Alastair Barrow. The record spoke of a man who had once been revered, known for his intellect and generosity. Yet, something had changed in him, something that had driven him to madness. It was said that he had discovered a secret within the castle, one that had granted him immense power, but at an unspeakable cost. The words painted a picture of obsession. Alastair had become consumed with unlocking the mysteries of the castle, delving deeper into forbidden knowledge until it had devoured him. He had spent his final years speaking to things unseen, conducting rituals in the dead of night, convinced that he was on the brink of immortality. But his end had been swift and brutal. His body found in the Great Hall, twisted and unrecognizable, as if something had ripped the very essence from him. Edward's hands trembled as he turned another page. The final passage chilled him to his core. He who seeks the heart of the castle must be prepared to sacrifice his own. The words felt like a warning, a final plea to any who might follow in Alastair's footsteps. But what did it mean? The heart of the castle. Was it a place, a relic, or something far more intangible? Before he could ponder further, a sudden force knocked the book from his hands. It landed with a sickening thud, the pages flipping wildly as if caught in a gust of wind. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it became a cacophony of voices overlapping, arguing, pleading. Edward staggered backward, pressing his hands to his ears, but the voices burrowed into his mind. "You are not ready. You must leave. You cannot stop it." Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise ceased. The silence was so absolute that Edward's own breathing sounded deafening. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he dared to open his eyes. The library remained unchanged, yet he knew something had shifted. The castle had given him a glimpse of the truth, but it was not yet ready to reveal everything. Taking a deep breath, Edward retrieved the book from the floor, carefully closing it before placing it back on the shelf. He understood now that knowledge came with a cost, and the deeper he ventured, the higher the price he would have to pay. But the castle had chosen him. It had spoken to him in a way it had not spoken to anyone in centuries. As he left the library, a new determination settled over him. He would find the heart of the castle. He would uncover the truth that had driven Alistair to madness. But unlike those before him, he would not succumb. He would master the darkness before it consumed him. Or so he hoped. Edward descended the spiral staircase with careful, deliberate steps, his mind weighed down by the revelations from the library. Each footfall echoed into the depths of the castle, as if the very walls were whispering their disapproval of his discoveries. The air grew colder as he went lower, and he soon realized he was heading into an area of the castle he had not yet explored, a subterranean level hidden beneath centuries of neglect and secrecy. The flickering candle in his hand cast dancing shadows against the damp stone, revealing carvings etched into the walls. At first, they seemed like decorative patterns, but as Edward's eyes adjusted, he saw them for what they truly were. Scenes of ritualistic offerings, figures bowing before an unseen presence. And in the center of it all, a great, pulsating mass shaped like a heart. His stomach twisted at the sight of it. Could this be what the book referred to as the heart of the castle? The corridor led him to a massive, rusted iron door, its surface marred by deep gouges as if something had tried to claw its way out. A feeling of intense dread settled over him, but he pressed forward, placing his hands against the cold metal. At his touch, the iron groaned as if waking from a deep slumber. The door did not open conventionally. Rather, it seemed to breathe, its hinges sighing as it surrendered to his presence. Beyond the door lay a cavernous chamber, unlike anything Edward had encountered before. The architecture was unnatural, the walls sloping in ways that defied logic, as though the castle had grown this space rather than it being built. Strange, bioluminescent fungi clung to the ceiling, casting an eerie green glow over the room. At the very center stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a blackened relic, pulsating faintly like a living thing. Edward's heart pounded as he approached the pedestal. The relic was shaped like an anatomical heart, yet it was hardened and covered in an obsidian-like material. It exuded an unnatural warmth, and as he reached out, a voice whispered from the depths of the chamber, barely louder than the sound of his own breathing. "Do you know what you seek?" Edward froze. The voice was neither human nor entirely alien. It felt as though it had been speaking for centuries, waiting for someone to finally listen. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to answer. "I seek the truth." The chamber responded with a low hum, the walls vibrating as if amused by his answer. The whispering grew louder, layering upon itself until it became an incomprehensible chorus of voices, pleading, warning, beckoning. The relic on the pedestal pulsed faster, its faint glow intensifying. "The truth will cost you." Edward hesitated. The words from the book echoed in his mind. He who seeks the heart of the castle must be prepared to sacrifice his own. Was this the moment of reckoning? If he took the relic, would he be following in Alistair's footsteps? Would he unravel the mystery, or would he become another lost soul claimed by the castle. His hand hovered over the relic. The moment stretched impossibly long, as if time itself was waiting for him to make a choice. Then, before he could decide, the castle made the choice for him. The walls shuddered violently, the very foundation of the chamber trembling with an unseen force. The iron door behind him slammed shut with a deafening clang. Edward stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. The whispering had become screams. The heart of the castle was awake, and it had been waiting for him. The chamber trembled with a force that felt alive, as if the castle itself had drawn a breath after centuries of silence. Edward's mind raced, torn between flight and the compulsion to understand what he had awakened. The walls groaned in protest, and the whispers had transformed into agonized wails, twisting and colliding in a cacophony that seemed to stretch from the depths of the castle's foundation to the unseen reaches of its highest towers. Edward turned to the iron door, his fingers clawing at its rusted surface, but it refused to budge. The chamber had sealed him in. His breathing grew shallow as he spun back to face the pedestal. The obsidian heart, no longer dormant, pulsed like a living organ, its glow now a deep arterial red. Each pulse sent a ripple through the air, distorting the space around it, as if time and reality were being stretched. Then a shape began to take form in the glow. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow coiling around the heart, but soon, limbs unfurled, a head tilted unnaturally to one side, and eyes, hollow, endless, knowing, fixed upon Edward. The figure was neither fully material nor entirely spectral, but its presence was undeniable. It did not move toward him, yet Edward felt its essence pressing against his chest, winding around his ribs, coiling through his thoughts. "You have come far," the figure intoned, its voice layered with the echoes of countless others. "But you do not yet understand." Edward swallowed the lump in his throat. "What are you?" His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the chamber's restless wails. The figure tilted its head further, the motion unnatural, like a marionette caught in tangled strings. "I am what remains. I am what was forsaken. And now, I awaken because you call me forth." The entity's form flickered, its presence distorting the space around it. Edward could feel his own mind warping, his memories twisting and bleeding into one another, past and present colliding like shattered glass. He stepped back, but the entity's influence followed. Visions flooded his mind. Alistair Moregrave, standing in this very chamber, hands bloodied, eyes wide with terror. A ritual incomplete, a door left ajar between realms, something waiting just beyond. Edward gasped as the images consumed him, his own identity wavering like a candle in a storm. "Your path is not yet written," the figure murmured, its form pulsing in time with the heart. "But it will be soon." The iron door shuddered violently, the rust flaking from its hinges. Edward barely had time to react before it burst open, the force sending him sprawling to the cold stone floor. The entity did not move, nor did it follow. It merely watched as Edward scrambled to his feet, his body trembling from the unnatural cold that had seeped into his bones. As he stumbled into the corridor, the whispers faded, but the presence of the heart remained lodged in his mind. The castle had begun to awaken, and whatever had slumbered within its walls was no longer content to be forgotten. Edward did not need to look back to know. He had already crossed the threshold of understanding, and there would be no turning back. Edward's breath came in ragged gasps as he staggered down the corridor, his boots slipping against the damp stone. Though the iron door had burst open, allowing him to escape the chamber of the obsidian heart, the oppressive weight of the entity's gaze lingered upon his back. The castle's very walls seemed to pulsate in response, as if the entire structure had become a living organism, aware of his trespass. The passageway ahead was familiar, yet wrong. The torches that had once lined the stone walls were now reduced to melted stumps, their dying embers casting long, flickering shadows that twisted unnaturally. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp decay, But beneath it lurked another smell. Something metallic, something sharp. Blood. Edward reached the next intersection, pausing to orient himself. But the architecture had changed. The grand staircase he had descended earlier was no longer there. In its place stood a narrow hallway, its ceiling slanting at an odd angle, leading deeper into the castle's bowels. He turned, expecting to see the path he had come from, but it too had transformed. The walls had closed in, sealing him off from any retreat. The realization clawed at his mind. He was no longer moving through a structure bound by earthly physics. The castle was shifting, warping, bending to an unseen will. His presence had disturbed something buried beneath centuries of silence, and now it was reshaping itself around him. A low groan echoed from the walls, followed by a series of soft, wet pattering sounds. Edward's pulse spiked. Something was moving in the darkness ahead, its form just beyond the reach of the failing torchlight. He pressed himself against the cold stone, straining to listen. The sound was unlike footsteps. It was more organic, more fluid, like the slither of flesh against stone. Then a whisper, not the disembodied murmurs that had haunted him before, but a voice clear and close, spoken directly into his ear. "Edward, you are not the first." He spun, his heart slamming against his ribs, but there was no one behind him. Yet, the breath of the words still lingered against his skin, ice cold and undeniable. His hands clenched into fists, his fingernails digging into his palms in a desperate attempt to ground himself in reality. But what reality remained in a place that no longer obeyed the laws of time and space? He had to move. To stand still was to invite the unknown closer. Forcing his feet forward, he entered the slanted hallway, the walls pressing in as if the castle itself were trying to swallow him whole. The pattering grew louder. Shapes darted at the edges of his vision, too fast, too many, impossible to fully perceive. They did not approach, but remained just outside his reach, watching. A door loomed at the hallway's end, its wooden surface warped and cracked, but still intact. Edward reached for the handle, hesitating only for a moment before twisting it open. The door groaned against his push, revealing a vast, open chamber bathed in a dim, pulsing glow. His stomach twisted at the sight before him. The walls were not made of stone, but of flesh, pale, veined, and shifting as if breathing. The glow came from within, illuminating the writhing mass that covered every surface. Embedded in the living walls were faces, some ancient, their expressions frozen in silent screams. Others fresh, their eyes still darting, their lips mouthing unheard pleas. Edward staggered back, ball rising in his throat. He had uncovered a truth beyond human comprehension. The castle was not merely haunted, it was alive, and it was hungry. Edward's breath hitched as the chamber's pulsating walls exhaled a sickly warmth. The faces embedded in the flesh writhed, their trapped expressions frozen between agony and pleading desperation. Their lips moved noiselessly, their wide, panicked eyes locking onto his. His stomach churned to the realization. These were not echoes of the past. These people were still aware, still suffering, their consciousnesses imprisoned within the castle's grotesque anatomy. The floor beneath his feet was damp and disturbingly warm, flexing slightly under his weight. It was as if he were standing on muscle, a thing alive rather than stone. He forced himself forward, his mind clawing for rational explanations. But reason was a luxury long lost in this place. The castle had abandoned all earthly rules, bending instead to something ancient and malevolent. A muffled sob echoed through the chamber, low and wet, followed by a chorus of whispers. They did not come from the walls, nor from the tortured faces. They slithered into his ears as though carried by an unseen force, their words tangling together, dissonant and broken. Run, stay, become, feed. Edward pressed his palms against his ears, but the voices only grew louder, forcing themselves into his thoughts, weaving into his very sense of self. A deep nausea crawled up his spine. He stumbled forward, desperate to escape, only for his foot to catch on something solid beneath him. He looked down. A hand protruded from the fleshy floor, fingers curled into a weak grasp, its pallid skin translucent under the chamber's eerie glow. Edward recoiled, but the fingers twitched, reaching toward him with trembling urgency. Against his better judgment, he knelt, hesitating only a second before gripping the wrist. It was ice cold. The hand squeezed back. A strangled gasp escaped from below, and with a grotesque squelch, a face emerged from the floor. A woman's, gaunt and sunken-eyed, her lips cracked and trembling. She tried to speak, but only a rattling breath came out, her body struggling against whatever force held her captive beneath the living floor. Edward's chest tightened at the sight of her. A prisoner unlike the others, not yet fully consumed. "Help me," she rasped. Her voice was barely more than a breath, yet cut through the chorus of whispers like a blade. Edward gritted his teeth and pulled harder, his muscles burning as he tried to wrench her free. The floor resisted, tightening around her shoulders like a hungry mouth, but he did not let go. His pulse pounded in his skull, and just as he felt his grip slipping, the chamber let out a deep, guttural groan. The walls convulsed. The whispering ceased. Then, the screaming began. The walls shuddered violently, sending a tremor through the grotesque chamber. Edward barely managed to steady himself as the very structure of the castle groaned, the sound deep and resonant, like a beast stirring from a long slumber. The woman's scream was swallowed by the rising wail of the trapped souls, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of agony. The floor beneath him pulsed angrily, and he felt it tightening around his legs, as if the castle itself had decided he had lingered too long. The woman's hand remained in his grasp, her grip tightening with desperation. Edward pulled harder, his breath ragged as the living floor resisted, stretching and sinewy like tendons fighting to snap back into place. Then, with a sickening rip, she was free. She collapsed against him, her frail body shivering violently. The space where she had been embedded writhed, closing over itself as if sealing a wound. Edward could barely register the momentary relief before the chamber convulsed again. This time, the entire castle trembled, a deep, seismic shift that rattled through the stone corridors beyond. A monstrous heartbeat pounded in the walls, rhythmic and slow, yet growing louder with each pulse. The castle was no longer just watching, it was waking up. He hoisted the woman to her feet. "We have to move," he said, though he doubted either of them knew where safety lay. She nodded weakly, but her wide, terror-filled eyes were fixed on something behind him. Edward turned just in time to see the chamber walls splitting open. The faces that had been imprisoned in the flesh began to dissolve, their features melting away like wax under flame. From the gaping wounds in the walls, something slithered forth. A mass of writhing tendrils, black and glistening, unfurled from the darkness within, their ends curling like hungry fingers. The chamber filled with a suffocating stench, rot and bile, as though the castle's true form was finally revealing itself. The whispers returned, but now they spoke in a singular, unified voice, deep and guttural, echoing through every inch of the space. "You do not leave. You are part of me now." Edward's pulse slammed against his ribs as he yanked the woman toward the exit. But the chamber had other plans. The tendril struck, lashing out with whip-like speed. One coiled around Edward's ankle, sending him sprawling onto the pulsing floor. Another wrapped around the woman's wrist, pulling her back toward the abyss. She screamed, a sound so raw and human that it sent a bolt of fury through Edward's veins. He twisted on his back, reaching for the dagger at his waist. With one swift motion, he slashed at the tendril holding him. The blade bit deep, and a thick, black ichor sprayed from the wound. The appendage recoiled with a shriek, releasing him instantly. Without hesitation, he turned to the woman, who was being dragged back toward the gaping wound in the wall. Her fingers clawed at the fleshy ground, leaving deep grooves as she fought against the pull. Edward lunged, grasping her free hand and yanking her with all his strength. The castle howled in rage. The tendrils retracted, the walls sealing shut as though they had never been breached. The heartbeat slowed, fading into an eerie silence. Edward held onto the woman as they stumbled into the next corridor, both gasping for breath. The castle had tried to claim them, but they had resisted. And now, Edward knew with certainty, whatever malevolence ruled this place, it was no longer content to watch from shadows. It was coming for them. The air grew impossibly still, as if the entire castle had paused to reconsider its next move. Edward and the woman staggered forward, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with grotesque carvings that seemed to shift when not directly observed. The walls pulsed faintly, no longer stone, but something more organic, something that had been alive long before they had ever set foot inside. Then, the whispering returned. But this time, it was not the scattered voices of trapped souls, nor the singular, guttural command of the castle itself. It was something else, something deeper, older. It seeped into Edward's mind like water through fractured stone, urging him forward rather than holding him back. Beneath, beneath, beneath. The woman clutched his arm. "It wants us to go deeper," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic throb of the walls. Edward met her gaze, and in that moment, he saw something beyond fear, something closer to recognition. "Have you been here before?" he asked, suddenly certain that her presence was no coincidence. She hesitated, then nodded. "Not in this life." Before he could demand an explanation, the corridor trembled violently, and a massive rupture split the ground beneath them. The floor yawned open like a gaping wound, revealing an abyss that should have been black but instead glowed with a sickly, golden light. Edward barely managed to grab onto the jagged edge, his legs dangling over what looked like an impossible depth. The woman clung to him, but she was not struggling. She was staring into the chasm as if she knew what lay below. Then, she spoke words that chilled Edward more than anything the castle had done thus far. "We were never meant to leave." Before he could respond, the edge crumbled and they fell. The descent was not a fall in the traditional sense. They were not plunging through space, but rather through time itself. The walls of the abyss were not stone, but shifting layers of history. Bodies pressed together in an eternal scream, faces morphing into others, and then others still. Edward felt something unravel within him, memories that were not his own flickering through his mind. He saw his hands, carving sigils into the castle walls. He saw blood offerings made beneath a full moon. He saw himself, or something that had once been him, kneeling before a shadow with too many eyes. The impact never came. They landed softly, as if the very air had caught them, and when Edward opened his eyes, they were no longer in the ruined castle. They stood in a grand hall, its architecture pristine, untouched by decay. Golden chandeliers bathed the space in flickering light, and rows of figures in ceremonial robes stood silently before a massive altar. Edward turned to the woman, realization dawning upon him. "We've been here before," he whispered. She nodded. "And now, we remember." The figures at the altar turned as one. Their faces were familiar. They were their own. And then, the golden light turned red. The golden light that once bathed the hall in warmth now bled into a deep, pulsing red, casting long, twisted shadows along the towering stone walls. Edward's breath caught in his throat as he stood frozen, his mind grappling with the impossible sight before him. The figures at the altar, standing motionless in ceremonial robes, were not strangers. They were themselves duplicates of Edward and the woman, their faces hollow, their eyes void of life but filled with terrible understanding. A slow, rhythmic sound began to echo through the chamber, like a heartbeat, but not of any singular being. It was the castle itself, throbbing in anticipation. The figures at the altar raised their hands in unison, palms stained with something dark and thick, dripping onto the ancient stone beneath them. Edward's pulse quickened as memories long buried clawed their way to the surface of his mind. He knew what was happening. "We were them," the woman whispered, her voice distant, as though she were speaking through centuries. and we will be them again. Edward clenched his fists. No, he said, shaking his head. I refuse to be trapped in this cycle. But even as he spoke, the room twisted, warping around them, reality itself bending under the weight of whatever force controlled this place. The walls whispered his name, and the air became thick with the scent of iron. The robed figures began to move, their bodies stiff and mechanical, each step in perfect synchronization. They surrounded Edward and the woman, enclosing them in a circle. A familiar sensation crept up Edward's spine, the feeling of being watched, not by any singular presence, but by the castle itself. Then, a voice, deeper than any human throat could produce, spoke from the altar. The offering must be completed. The realization crashed down upon Edward like a collapsing wall. This was not merely a place of suffering, it was a machine, a ritual, a cycle that had played out over and over again, trapping souls in an endless loop of sacrifice and rebirth. He and the woman were merely the latest iteration. A sharp pain bloomed in Edward's chest, and when he looked down, his own hand was gripping a dagger, one that had not been there moments before. His fingers curled around the hilt against his will, and he felt the weight of 1,000 past selves guiding his movement. He looked up, locking eyes with the woman, and saw her holding an identical blade. "This is how it ends," she murmured. "No," Edward growled, fighting against the unseen force that pressed his hand forward. His own reflection in the nearest robed figure's mask stared back at him, a perfect replica of himself from a past life. He realized then the only way to break the cycle was not to fight it, but to refuse it entirely. With a roar of defiance, Edward let go of the dagger and stepped back. The woman's eyes widened, and in that moment, she too seemed to break free from the unseen force. The castle trembled, as if the very foundation of its existence had been shaken. The robed figures faltered, their perfect movements growing disjointed. The pulsing red light flickered, and the whispers grew into agonized screams. Then, everything collapsed. The castle walls cracked like brittle bones, the ceiling above them caving in as shadows screamed and writhed, desperately clinging to their victims. Edward grabbed the woman's hand and ran, the ground beneath them splitting apart, revealing the abyss they had fallen into before. But this time, the abyss did not pull them in. It rejected them. They burst through the ruins of the castle, and as soon as they crossed its threshold, the entire structure caved inward, disappearing into a vortex of darkness. The air was silent. The castle was gone. Edward and the woman stood in the middle of the forest, the sky above them clear, as if the nightmare had never happened. They turned to each other, breathing heavily, the weight of the experience still pressing upon them. "We did it," she whispered. Edward nodded, but deep inside, a terrible thought gnawed at him. Had they truly escaped, or had they only reset the cycle in another form? As they walked away, neither of them noticed the faint sound of whispers carried by the wind, nor the way the shadows beneath the trees stretched just a little too far in their direction.